Dick Cheney appeared on Meet the Press to describe how interrogation policies were about to change.
We have to work sort of the dark side, if you will. We're going to spend time in the shadows in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in. And so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective.
It's very clear that it starts in the office of Vice President Cheney. He had a very strong view that we were not as aggressive in dealing with people in interrogations as we could or should be. Taking the gloves off, being rough with detainees.
If Dick Cheney was the primary architect of a new policy, John Yoo was the chief draftsman. He wrote guiding opinions which argued for a flexible approach to treating suspected terrorists.
The United States used to treat terrorism as a criminal justice problem. The September 11th attacks showed that the struggle with al-Qaeda had moved into warfare. And I think when a foreign entity for political purposes can kill 3,000 Americans, cause billions of dollars of damage, and try to eliminate the leaders of the American government, that sounds like war to most people. It doesn't sound like crime.
President Bush declared a war on terror, but he raised questions about whether suspected terrorists should be protected by the laws of war, the Geneva Conventions. Atrocities that shocked the conscience of the world gave rise to the modern Geneva Conventions, international treaties meant to provide fundamental protections for every human being captured in wartime. In effect, for over 50 years, Geneva offered legal protections and prohibited interrogators from using torture, murder, or even humiliating and degrading treatment. After 9/11, John Yoo worked closely with Dick Cheney's office and Alberto Gonzales, the counsel to the president. They wrote a series of memos arguing that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to suspected terrorists. And they gave legal cover for the CIA and Special Forces to embark on a secret program of previously forbidden interrogation techniques.
Mohammed al-Qahtani, in many ways, that single interrogation, protected interrogation, contains within it, if you will, the entire genealogy, the entire history of CIA torture over the last 50 years. The CIA launched a mind control project, a veritable Manhattan Project of the mind, in the 1950s. In-house, the CIA worked on exotic techniques, hypnosis, and then they worked on sodium pentothal, and then they worked on electroshock, and ultimately they discovered LSD. All of that drug stuff in-house went nowhere, except to lawsuits. But what did work was the CIA outsourced all of the dull behavioral research to the most brilliant behavioral scientists at the top universities in the United States and Canada.
At McGill, experiments by famed psychologist Donald O. Hebb caught the eye of CIA researchers.
Dr. Hebb found that he could induce a state akin to acute psychosis in 48 hours. All he did was he had student volunteers sit in a very pleasant air-conditioned cubicle with goggles, gloves, and earmuffs. Actually, you know what they looked just like? The Guantanamo detainees. If you see that, those outfits that the Guantanamo detainees have, where they have the gloves and the goggles and the earmuffs, now everybody thinks, oh, that's security. No, 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 that's sensory breakdown. Within a day, there would be hallucinations. Within 2 days, breakdown.
I began to think while we were doing our experiments that it's possible that something that involves physical discomfort or even pain might be more tolerable than simply the deprivation conditions that we studied.
The CIA was fascinated by this. They jumped on it immediately.
I had no idea what a potentially vicious weapon this could be.
They identified two key techniques. They identified sensory disorientation, and they identified self-inflicted pain, standing, for days at a time while fluids flowed to the legs. And they put them together in the QBARC Counterintelligence Interrogation Manual. And they propagated around the world and through the U.S. intelligence community. Think about what al-Qahtani was subjected to, okay? First of all, he's in dark, he's in light, he's in cold, he's in heat. What they're doing is they're attacking his universal sensory receptors. They're also scrambling his time. So that's phase one. In Guantanamo, under the regime of General Miller, he turned Guantanamo into a veritable behavioral scientific laboratory. And Donald Rumsfeld gave orders for techniques beyond the field manual. And they percolated in an ambiguous way that allowed people to kind of, do what they thought needed to be done. And they explored Arab male sensitivity to gender and sexual identity. So that's the thing about being homosexual, the underwear on the head, all that sort of stuff.
People were saying Arabs really are very sensitive to sexual humiliation. Well, who the hell isn't sensitive to sexual humiliation, Nobody wants to be stripped down naked and forced to masturbate with a hood over your head. It's ridiculous.
Then they created behavioral science consultation teams where they had military psychologists integrated into the ongoing interrogation to discover individual fears and phobias. And all of that was visited on al-Qahtani.
You are aware of communications between General Miller and Secretary Rumsfeld specifically about this one prisoner?
To our knowledge, there was a considerable amount of communication up and down the chain.
As you know from General Schmidt's report, he concluded that these techniques individually did not constitute torture. But he said that the sum of these techniques,
The cumulative effect of simultaneous applications of numerous authorized techniques had abusive and degrading impact on the detainee.
and he recommended that General Miller be disciplined. But he said it did not constitute torture.
We made a distinction between what torture and inhumane treatment would be given the general guidelines, and then what might be abusive and degrading. Something might be degrading but not necessarily torture, and it may not be inhumane. It may be humiliating, but it may not be torture. No torture, no physical pain, injury. There was a safe, secure environment the entire time.
And that, of course, is the genius of the CIA psychological paradigm. Psychological torture is all a matter of definitions, and it's very slippery indeed.
That sounds remarkably similar to what occurred at Abu Ghraib. People being led around in chains, people being forced to wear lingerie. Perhaps a coincidence, perhaps not.
If you look at those Abu Ghraib photographs, again, it's always the same techniques. First of all, there's the sexual activity with the woman's garments and the masturbation and all the rest. That's the cultural sensitivity. They're short shackled, they're long shackled, they're shackled upside down. These are stress positions. The most famous of all Abu Ghraib photographs, of course, of that hooded Iraqi standing on a box, arms outstretched. He's told that if he steps off the box, if he moves, he'll be electrocuted. That's the point of the fake electrical wires. So it's the absolute immobility for protracted periods, and then with arms extended. As we'd say to viewers, don't try this at home, but do try it. Just stand for 10 minutes with your arms stretched out, not moving.
اثنين كانت حالة من الفوضى ومن الإجراءات الأمنية الشديدة. يوم الثلاثاء اللي هو يوم اعتقالي ذهبت إلى عملي، مو عملي أنا، يعني كنا في موقع عمل في منطقة الحصوة، فأني أعمل في مجال الكهرباء. تم نقلي إلى سجن أبو غريب في بداية عام 2004 باليوم الأول من الشهر الأول لعام 2004. كان أكو شخص مدني واقف بيتأمر، يعني ياخذون أوامرهم من عنده اللي هم الشركات الأمنية. أدخلوني إلى الزنزانة، كبلوني، وتم خلع ملابسي بالقوة. يعني أسلوب من أساليبهم أنه القبض التناسلي للرجل يلفون عليه حبل ويجروه هيك مثل عملية الخنق. شنو الغاية من عندها؟ شنو هاي الأبرة تضربون إياها اللي أنا هسه حاليا حتى أطفال مدى يصيرون أدي؟ شنو الداعي لأنه جيش يستعين بشركات أمنية مدنية للتحقيق مع معتقلين؟ بس أنا أقول لك هاي الشركتين مؤكدة، شركة تايتن وشركة CI.
When I saw the photographs for the first time, and I said to the commander of the Criminal Investigation Division who was showing them to me, I said, why are the translators around the prisoners. Why are the translators in the cell block? And he said, ma'am, those aren't translators, those are khaki interrogators.
Khaki was hired by the Department of Interior out of a little town in Arizona called Sierra Vista, and they were hired to do database work. And that contract, which was sort of a blanket contract that allowed them to do a whole bunch of different things, was used to do interrogation in Abu Ghraib. So what ostensibly was a contract to do clerical work or IT work turned out to be getting information not from a computer but from human beings in a notorious prison in Iraq. At the time of the scandals in the spring of 2004, roughly 50% of the interrogators were private contractors. Corporations exist to make a profit, and when they are hired to do jobs, whether it's the provision of water or the interrogation of prisoners, their job is to get as much work as possible, make as much profit as possible. Now that doesn't work in the field of intelligence, period.
You do not put personnel who do not have allegiance and 100% loyalty to America, you do not put them in sensitive key government activities like military intelligence gathering. Here you have the MPs who engaged and participated in horrific conduct are being held accountable for their actions. Why aren't the U.S. contractors, the civilian corporate personnel, why aren't they being held accountable for their actions?
If you are a U.S. soldier and you hurt an Iraqi civilian and that becomes known, you will be court-martialed. But if you are a U.S. contractor and you kill an Iraqi civilian and that becomes known, you will be sent home. And then you can come back the following week and you can work for a different contractor.
So here we have the two ringleaders of abuse at Abu Ghraib very explicitly saying, in many cases, what was happening was they were being ordered to abuse these detainees by civilian contractors. These guys are in prison for 18 years total between the two of them, and there's no contractors in prison.
You stand, but we're going to have a representative of the other view. And I said, there's another view. And he said, oh yeah, we have a representative who worked for the Reagan administration. He thinks torture is okay under certain circumstances. So I wanted to say, well, bring him on, but that's been used in another context, and I avoid saying that. So I said to myself, okay, I'll do that. And I went down to my den and I said, now you have to be sort of responsible here, Ray. Why is torture not a good idea? And so I came up with 5 reasons. Maybe I'll just explain them briefly to you. The first, sort of, I'll recite them in what I consider to be the ascending order of importance, the most important last. Number 1 would be what John McCain and others always say, torture gives our country a bad name. Well, yeah, it does. Does that matter? Yes, it matters, but it's far from the most important reason. Number 2, torture endangers our own troops. We know that. That's why the Geneva Conventions were agreed upon by all civilized states. Now, I would make a point here. We're not talking only about physical torture. We're talking about mental torture. Suffice it to say that when you ask John McCain and others who spent 5 or 6 years in the Hanoi Hilton, you ask them, how did you persevere? How did you make it through? How did you do it? Invariably, all of them say, we did it because at the end of the day we could say, at least we don't do that. Now, our GIs, the ones who would be captured, don't even have the solace of being able to say that. Well, we'll go to the third one here, where torture just lengthens the Al-Qaeda recruiting lines, the recruiting lines of terrorists. It just makes it a growth industry. Number 4, or the next to the most important, is torture doesn't work. And we know that. On the very day that the President of the United States saw fit, a month ago, it was the 6th of September, saw fit to brag about the achievements of torture by CIA interrogators at these sites, these black hole sites. You know, al-Zubaydah told us about, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who told us about somebody else. Well, number one, folks, most of that was erroneous. Most of that was not factual. Most of that was lies, okay? But the unseemly act of the president bragging about what was achieved through what he called extra enhanced devices or whatever of torture was really quite bizarre, because at the same time, on the same day, the head of Army Intelligence was saying, look, we have issued a manual. And I know about this manual. When I was a first lieutenant in U.S. intelligence in the Army, we had to virtually memorize the manual on interrogation. We knew exactly what our rights were. We knew exactly how we needed to treat prisoners of war. So here's the head of Army Intelligence saying, we've got a new manual now, and this manual adheres scrupulously to the Geneva Convention, Article 3, Common Article 3, which prohibits the kinds of torture that we've seen go on in Abu Ghraib and other places like that. And then what he says, what he sees fit to say is, and this is a virtual quote, no good information has ever been obtained by means of harsh interrogation techniques. History tells us that, and the empirical experience of the last 5 years, dark years, tells us that, period, end quote. Now, that's pretty gratuitous. Here's the head of Army Intelligence saying the empirical experience of the last 5 years confirms the historical judgment that torture, that harsh interrogation techniques do not yield good information. He says no good information can be obtained that way. Now, that's the same day that the President of the United States is arguing for congressional authority to continue torturing people. It was bizarre, and yet it was lost on the press. And, of course, we now know that the so-called Military Commissions Act, which is really equivalent to Hitler's Enabling Act, will give the president dictatorial powers not only to suspend habeas corpus, but to torture, to define his own definition, make his own definition of torture, and pursue these policies. So number 4 is, it doesn't work. Don't believe any of these cockamamie stories about, the ticking bomb in Times Square and, this guy sure knows it. Never happens, never happened. And you have to take my word for that. We have 57 veteran intelligence professionals for sanity now, and our common experience tells us that. And number 5, the most important reason, of course, is torture is wrong. It's intrinsically wrong. I mean, it's in the same category as slavery or rape. Always, always wrong. That's why there are laws against it. That's why there are international conventions against it. It's not wrong because there are laws against it. There are laws against it because it's wrong. And all civilized countries subscribe to that until this president, on the very day of 9/11, at a meeting after he addressed the nation, convened Richard Clark, the head of his counterterrorism unit, and Donald Rumsfeld in a small room in the basement of the White House, and said, quote, I don't care what the international lawyers say, we're going to kick some ass, period, end quote.